The girl lost both of her parents at a young age. As she grew up, her stunning beauty quickly turned her into a rising star, but her beauty and kindness brought her no luck. Before long, the media began sensationalizing one scandal after another about her. Overwhelmed by despair, the girl eventually chose to end her own life. But when the truth was finally revealed, people realized that the scandal had actually been a carefully orchestrated plot to destroy her. That day, the young detective Hajime was invited to take part in a treasure-hunting TV show. He would be traveling with the production crew to a remote island called Rinken Island. According to legend, 400 million yen worth of gold bars were buried somewhere on the island. Hajime and the other guests simply had to find the treasure within the allotted time. The cast included comedian Taiki, actress Hataru, and a mysterious girl named Ishiki. There was also Fuma, a brilliant student from a prestigious university. The show's special guest was the famous actress Reika. Her manager, Satsuki, came along with her as well. Hajime's childhood friend Miyuki also came to the island as an assistant for the production. The production crew consisted of producer Shin, director Ryuko, assistant director Takuya, female host Christina, and a cameraman named Fujimori. Everyone gathered inside a villa on the island. The original owner of the villa, Izaki, was said to have been a brilliant physicist, but in his later years, he became obsessed with alchemy. According to legend, Izaki's alchemy was incredibly powerful. He could supposedly turn stones into gold. There were even rumors that he had discovered the secret to immortality. Izaki eventually built this villa to conduct his ultimate research into alchemy, but sometime later, he mysteriously disappeared inside the villa. The strange legend cast a dark shadow over the guests who had come to search for the treasure. The group then began assigning rooms. Producer Shin had Takuya prepare slips of paper for a random draw. Everyone would draw a slip to determine their room. Once the room assignments were settled, everyone returned to their rooms to rest. The layout of the villa was extremely strange. Even the room numbers were arranged in no particular order. Coincidentally, Reika's room was located close to Hajime's, so Reika repeatedly invited Hajime to her room to play cards. Her room was room 79. As soon as Hajime reached the door, he noticed that it was made of metal and had a very unusual design. Once inside, they discovered that the door could be locked from the inside with a door bolt. All the windows were fitted with iron bars, making the entire room feel more like a prison. Late that night, everyone had fallen asleep, but Takuya couldn't sleep. Suddenly, someone knocked on his door. When he opened it, he saw a masked figure standing outside, holding a broadsword. In the next instant, the broadsword was driven straight through his body. The next morning, everyone realized that Takuya was nowhere to be found, but before they could even begin searching for him, they were shocked to discover that the yacht they had arrived on had been burned to the ground. The only small boat left on the island had also disappeared. Everyone began to suspect that Takuya had found the gold and escaped from the island alone. They were now completely stranded on the isolated island. Hajime suggested checking the security footage from the camera installed near the elevator to see who had been coming and going on the second floor. A masked figure suddenly appeared on the footage. The figure was holding a broadsword and repeatedly swinging it around in a strange manner. Ishiki immediately realized that the figure was dressed like an alchemist. According to the legend, Izaki had always dressed in exactly the same way. Just then, a drop of blood fell from the ceiling onto Reika. Everyone looked up. Takuya's body was hidden inside the space above the ceiling. They brought the body down and examined the wounds. It was clear that Takuya had been killed by the broadsword held by the masked figure. The killer could be hiding somewhere inside the villa, or they could even be one of the people standing among them. Panic immediately spread through the group. Director Ryuko suggested that everyone stay inside their own rooms and wait for help. But Hajime was more concerned about one thing: the whereabouts of the broadsword. Ishiki then made a shocking claim. She believed that the sword had been hidden using alchemy. She also insisted that the alchemist Izaki must still be alive. According to her, he was hiding somewhere inside the villa, preparing to kill everyone who had come looking for the treasure. After returning to his room, Hajime began piecing together the clues surrounding the case. There was something strangely familiar about the villa's floor plan, but he couldn't remember where he had seen a layout like this before. Meanwhile, actress Hataru was lying on her bed listening to music. As she listened, she gradually fell asleep. Then, a hand seemed to pass straight through the door from the outside. Reaching inside to unlock the bolt, the cloaked masked figure appeared once again, raising the broadsword high above his head. He viciously plunged it toward Hataru on the bed. Meanwhile, Hajime was suddenly awakened by frantic knocking on his door. When he went over to investigate, he found Reika's hair accessory lying outside his room. A terrible feeling suddenly came over him, and he immediately set out to find Reika. When he reached Reika's room, the door was wide open, but there was no one inside. A blood-stained piece of clothing was lying on the floor. Hajime immediately recognized it as Hataru's clothing. He rushed to Hataru's room, but the person who opened the door was a sleepy-eyed Reika. Hajime immediately rushed inside, only to be horrified to discover that Hataru was already dead on the bed. Hajime quickly examined the crime scene. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside, making this a classic locked room murder. Reika therefore became the prime suspect. Reika insisted that she was a victim as well. She had originally been on her way to find Hajime, but someone attacked her from behind and knocked her unconscious. When she regained consciousness, she heard Hajime knocking on the door. Shin agreed with Reika's explanation. After all, there was no reason for the killer to go through the trouble of locking themselves inside the room with the victim, only to leave a blood-stained piece of clothing behind and lure everyone else to the crime scene. But that raised an even bigger question. How had the killer entered Hataru's room in the first place? And how had they managed to leave? Ishiki spoke up once again. She believed the killer was the alchemist, Izaki. After all, only he would possess the ability to manipulate metal. But her explanation was clearly too far-fetched, so no one took her seriously. Host Christina believed Reika was highly suspicious. For everyone's safety, she suggested locking Reika up until they could figure out what was really going on. Worried that Reika might be frightened, kind-hearted Miyuki volunteered to stay with her. Reika was deeply touched by Miyuki's kindness, and Hajime agreed to the arrangement. The entire scene was captured by cameraman Fujimori. Miyuki and Reika were then placed inside an empty room. The door bolts on both the inside and outside were secured. That meant the people inside couldn't get out, while no one outside could get in. Hajime passed a rope into the room. The other end of the rope was connected to Shin's room. If Miyuki or Reika encountered any danger, they could simply pull the rope to alert everyone. Hajime then began searching for clues that could explain how the killer had committed the locked room murder. The metal door was extremely sturdy, and the door and frame fit tightly together. There wasn't even enough of a gap to slip anything through and move the heavy door bolt. Hajime couldn't figure out how the killer had managed to get inside. Meanwhile, Director Ryuko was so terrified that she had been drinking heavily, but when she went to the bathroom, the masked killer suddenly attacked her. At the same time, Shin suddenly felt the rope connected to his room being pulled. He immediately rushed over to investigate, only to discover that the door bolt outside Reika's room had disappeared. A moment later, Reika opened the door. She explained that while she and Miyuki had been talking, they had somehow fallen asleep without realizing it. Hajime immediately sensed that something was wrong. He concluded that someone had drugged them with sleeping pills. Just then, Satsuki came running over in a panic and told everyone that Ryuko had been killed. Everyone rushed to the bathroom and found Ryuko's body. Hajime then realized that cameraman Fujimori had been missing for quite some time. They searched the villa and eventually discovered that Fujimori had been killed in the same room where Takuya had died. He had been beaten to death with a vase. Hajime then noticed the artificial flowers scattered across the floor. Christina immediately concluded that Reika was the killer. She believed Reika had secretly teamed up with Fujimori. First, Reika had drugged Miyuki and knocked her unconscious. Then she asked Fujimori to open the door and let her out. After that, Reika had killed Fujimori while he was off guard to silence him, before heading to the bathroom and murdering Ryuko. Christina insisted that Reika should be tied up. Most of the people there agreed with Christina's theory. Only Hajime and Miyuki continued to believe that Reika wasn't the killer. To calm everyone down, Reika had no choice but to allow herself to be tied up. But the fear among the group still didn't disappear. Satsuki was especially terrified, convinced that she might become the killer's next target. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. It was Hajime and Miyuki. Hajime had noticed something all the victims had in common. They were all members of the production crew. So Hajime began to wonder if something had happened between them in the past. But when Hajime questioned Satsuki about it, she looked terrified and immediately drove them out of the room. As Hajime was leaving, he heard Satsuki quietly mutter a name, Kamioka. Hajime immediately picked up on the important clue and went to Shin for more information. Shin explained that Kamioka had been an idol. She had made her debut at just 14 and was once considered one of the industry's brightest young stars. As far as Shin remembered, Kamioka had a very promising future, but when she was 16, the media suddenly exposed a drug scandal involving her. Her promising career was destroyed overnight. Eventually, driven to despair, Kamioka took her own life. Hajime realized that Kamioka's tragic fate must somehow be connected to the victims. He then approached Fuma and Ishiki to ask them what they knew. Like Hajime, Both of them had earned their spots on the show by winning a puzzle competition. They had been invited at random, so there was no obvious reason for either of them to have any connection to Kamioka's death. But there was something suspicious about Fuma. Hajime had personally seen Fuma handing money to Takuya, suggesting that some kind of secret deal existed between them. Fuma openly explained why. He had been a huge fan of Hataru for years. He had always wanted a chance to get close to her, so he paid Takuya to help him. Before leaving, Fuma revealed one more crucial detail. Hataru had previously starred in a hugely successful movie, but she hadn't originally been cast as the female lead. The original actress had been replaced for some reason. Only then did Hataru get the role, and the actress who had starred opposite her was Reika. Fuma's words suddenly made Hajime realize something. He immediately went to the library and began researching information about the Philosopher's Stone. At last, he found the clue he had been looking for. He then watched all the recorded footage from the show from beginning to end. And finally, Hajime saw through every part of the killer's elaborate plan. So Hajime immediately gathered everyone in the living room and began explaining his theory. Miyuki opened a book about alchemy, and the diagram of the alchemical circle inside was exactly the same as the floor plan of the villa. That was because the villa had been designed and built by Izaki himself, who had been obsessed with alchemy. He had incorporated numerous elements of alchemy into the villa's design. At first glance, the room numbers appeared to be nothing more than random numbers, but when viewed from the perspective of chemistry, they were actually the atomic numbers on the periodic table. Each guest room had a door made from the corresponding metal on the periodic table. Shin stayed in room 12, whose door was made of magnesium. Fuma stayed in room 29, whose door was made of copper. Ishiki stayed in room 13, whose door was made of aluminum. And Hataru, who was murdered inside the locked room, stayed in room 50, whose door was made of tin. Every metal has its own unique physical properties, and tin's properties held the key to solving this locked room murder. The killer really had managed to walk through the wall, but there was no magic involved. The killer had simply melted the metal door. Tin has a very low melting point, so an ordinary blowtorch was enough to melt it. That was how the killer carried out the murder inside a locked room. Hajime then began reconstructing the killer's method. The killer used a simple blowtorch to melt the middle section of the tin door to Hataru's room, creating a hole large enough to reach through. The killer then reached through the hole and unlocked the door from the inside. After killing Hataru, the killer reached through the hole from outside and locked the door again. The killer then inserted a pre-prepared piece of tin of the same size into the hole and filled the remaining gaps with melted tin. Finally, the killer used a plaster mold prepared in advance to reshape the repaired area. This completely concealed any signs that the door had been tampered with. The broadsword used by the killer was also made of tin. After carrying out the murder, the killer melted down the broadsword and poured the liquid tin into the vase in Fujimori's room. The artificial flowers inside the vase had been cut unusually short to conceal the fact that the vase was filled with a large amount of tin. An ordinary clay vase would never have been heavy enough to kill someone. It was the heavy block of tin hidden inside that had actually become the murder weapon that killed Fujimori. The killer's mistake was leaving the artificial flowers behind. That small detail allowed Hajime to notice that something was wrong. Hajime concluded that only the first victim, Takuya, had actually been killed with the broadsword. The killer melted it down immediately after the murder. Although the wounds on the other two victims looked very similar to Takuya's, they had actually been inflicted with a short blade capable of creating wide wounds. Fuma immediately raised an objection. If Hajime's theory was correct, then the killer must have chosen the murder location in advance, but the rooms had been assigned randomly by drawing lots. There was no way the killer could have controlled the results. Hajime explained that Hataru drawing room 50 was actually part of the killer's plan. Following the production crew's usual rule, the guests drew lots from youngest to oldest. Assistant director Takuya had secretly prepared a stack of fake slips, all marked with the number 50. When the actual drawing began, he first removed all the genuine slips from the box. Then he filled the box entirely with the fake room 50 slips. When it was Hataru's turn, the only slips left in the box were all marked 50. She had no choice but to draw room 50. Next, it was Fuma's turn. He removed all the remaining fake slips from the box, put the genuine slips back inside, and then revealed a room 29 slip that he had prepared in advance. That way, Hataru ended up in room 50, while Fuma successfully got room 29. So the real killer was Fuma. The reason Fuma killed Takuya first was because Takuya was the only person who knew about the rigged room assignment. If Fuma had gone after Hataru first, Takuya would have immediately exposed what he had done. With the evidence laid out in front of him, Fuma finally confessed. He admitted to killing Takuya, Hataru, Ryuko, and Fujimori. He had no personal grudge against Fujimori, but Fujimori had a keen eye and noticed Fuma acting suspiciously while filming around the villa. That left Fuma with no choice but to silence him as well. Fuma's true identity was that he was Kamioka's older brother. Kamioka had been framed and falsely accused of using drugs, ultimately being driven to take her own life. The two siblings had lost their parents when they were young and were sent to a welfare institution. They were later adopted by different families. When they were separated, Kamioka was devastated. The siblings never saw each other again after that. Later, Fuma's adoptive parents had biological children of their own, and his position within the family became increasingly awkward. His adoptive parents were even unwilling to pay for his university tuition. Fuma could only support himself by working part-time. One day, Fuma saw his sister's picture on the cover of a magazine. Kamioka had already debuted as an idol. Fuma sent her a letter pretending to be a fan. Inside the letter, he included a secret code that only the two siblings could understand. Kamioka immediately realized who he was. The siblings finally reconnected and began communicating through phone calls and emails. To avoid causing any rumors, they never met in person. When Kamioka learned that Fuma was struggling financially, she offered to support him through university. With his sister's financial support, Fuma was finally able to graduate. After that, Kamioka landed the lead role in a movie, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. But one day, Kamioka suddenly sent Fuma a strange text message. She begged her brother to believe her and insisted that she had done nothing wrong. After that message, the siblings lost contact completely. Not long afterward, Fuma learned from the newspaper that Kamioka had been accused of using drugs and had taken her own life. A few days later, Fuma received a letter Kamioka had sent before her death. The letter revealed the entire truth. Director Ryuko, assistant director Takuya, Hataru, who had competed with Kamioka for the lead role, and manager Satsuki had all conspired together. They fabricated a drug scandal against Kamioka and completely destroyed her career. In the letter, Kamioka swore that she had never touched drugs. From that moment on, Fuma swore that he would personally make everyone responsible for his sister's death pay. There was originally one more person Fuma intended to kill. That person was Reika. When the movie was casting its actors, Fuma suspected that Reika also knew the truth behind what had happened. When Fuma confronted her, Reika didn't try to hide anything. Kamioka had once told Reika how much she loved the movie and how much she hoped they could eventually play opposite each other. After Kamioka's death, Reika voluntarily accepted the role. She wanted to fulfill the dream Kamioka had never been able to realize. After hearing the truth, Fuma burst into tears. Thankfully, he had not yet had the chance to kill Reika. The next day, the police arrived on the island and began searching the villa. In the basement, they discovered Azaki's remains. He had died of natural causes. The police arrested Fuma and took him away. Although Fuma had committed unforgivable crimes, once the truth became public, the false accusations against Kamioka were finally cleared. Meanwhile, Hajime excitedly announced that he had found the gold bars. According to the periodic table, gold has an atomic number of 79, which happened to be the number of Reika's room. Hajime concluded that the door to room 79 was actually made of gold, with only a thin layer of silver covering its surface. But by then, the treasure had already been taken by Ishiki, and her true identity was none other than the gentleman thief.